what are the best ways to ensure that assessment systems work? They're going to be talking about that. All education needs to worry about that. How can technology be used to enhance the student and the teacher experience? And it's a very hot topic. So I'd like to introduce the panel moderator. It's Romy Short. She's Director of Assessment at Renaissance Learning. So welcome, Romy Short. Romy? And these are...
Yeah, is it over to me? Yeah, well, so good afternoon, welcome fellow EdTechers, and how fantastic it is to be here in such a cool place, obviously, which we need on such a day. I want to hand over straight to the panel, and on my right, directly on my right, I've got Christine Kirkup, who's going to introduce herself. Christine is the head of Centre for Assessment at National Foundation for Education Research. Christine.
Okay. Yes, I'm the head of assessment at NFER. Just to tell you a little bit about the sort of work that NFER are currently involved in e-assessment. We do write questions for a wide variety of tests, including e-assessments, online tests including the STA's teacher skills tests. We also develop items for the NAPLAN tests, which are used in Australia, a national testing programme for years 3, 5, 7 and 9. Some of my colleagues are developing items which will be piloted in the ETIMS International Survey in 2019. We recently were asked to do a feasibility study for e-assessment in Rwanda. And we also are just beginning an e-assessment research programme, which I'll tell you a little bit about later on.
Yeah, fine. I'm now going to pass to Matthew. Matthew Wingfield is the chair of the E-Assessment Association and has been so for the past 4 years. Matthew.
Thanks, Romy. So Matt Wingfield, chairman of the E-Assessment Association. It's a hobby, really. The Assessment Association is entirely voluntary, so it's people giving up time to support the good stuff that can happen with e-assessment. My day job is working for an e-assessment provider, so you could argue I have somewhat of a vested interest working for a company called Digital Assess. My background is wholeheartedly a teacher, so I started my career as a primary school teacher and thoroughly enjoyed that and moved into the world of supporting the learning and the assessment process, having done that.
And a special welcome to Richard Slade, who's a head teacher, arrived from Royal Borough of Greenwich just about half an hour ago, so fresh from the classroom. Richard.
Thank you. My name's Richard Slade. I'm head teacher at Plumcroft Primary School, which is in the Royal Borough of Greenwich, and we're a large primary school. We have just over 760 children. And we're just in the process of building a second campus in the heart of Woolwich for another 420. And our key objective is, from an assessment point of view, is making sure that it's accurate and we can trust it. But I'll talk about that in a minute. My background is turning round failing and underperforming schools. And this is my 5th school that I've done that with in my career. I've now been at this school for just over 6 years, and this is my intent to stay and just see how far you can take a state community school from an educational achievement enrichment point of view. So that's my passion and how we use assessment to make that happen.
Okay, thank you. So just as a reminder, we've got our header, which is the role of E, formative and summative assessment, but I just want to unpick that with the panel, if you'll bear with me. So, Katherine, if I can invite you first of all to comment on the fact that assessment does allow the teacher and the students to monitor their progress. So what are the best ways to ensure that assessment systems work?
Okay, right. I'm going to talk very generally about the purposes of assessment. I'm going to talk about the difference between formative and summative assessment, the theory, if you like, and then I'm going to pass on to my 2 colleagues who are going to talk about more practical applications. So if we just start with an assessment system as a whole, it needs to meet a number of different purposes. And an effective system will therefore be made up of a number of different assessments, each specifically used for a particular purpose. But of course, the problem with that is there are lots of different purposes for assessment. Some years ago, an ex-colleague of mine, Dr. Paul Newton, made a list, and I think he got to over 20 different purposes of assessment. So let's just talk about some of the key ones for a school at the school level rather than at the system level, which is another area we won't be talking about today. So obviously one of the key ones is identifying a pupil or a student's learning needs. What do they know now? What do they understand? What can they do now? What skills do they have in order to identify their learning needs and their next steps? Where do they go next? You also want to diagnose particular learning needs. You want to monitor progress. And you want to summarise attainment at the end of particular phases of education in order to report to parents, to report to governors and other stakeholders. You also want to benchmark your performance against local standards or national standards. As I say, I'm not going to touch the system level. There you're looking at completely different things, accountability, but I'm just going to concentrate on the school level. So some assessments are more or less appropriate for each of those purposes that I just talked about. And the mode of assessment can also be really important, and it's something you need to consider. So why use e-assessment rather than other forms of assessment? Is it an appropriate form of assessment for what I want to use it for? I'm going to come back to e-assessment actually, but I'm just going to talk briefly about formative and summative. So formative assessment, well, it can be a question, it can be a conversation, it can be an observation, it can be a task, it can be all sorts of things, it can be a test. Formative assessment is not the mode of assessment, it's what you're using it for. And obviously with formative assessment, you're using it to assess where is the student at the moment, what are their next steps, and what can I do to support that student in their learning. With summative assessment, you're summarising attainment at a particular period of time, and that may be after a topic, at the end of a half term, a term, or even at the end of a particular phase of education. So it may be qualifications at the end of, Key Stage 4. I refer to my notes, make sure. So again, the different types of assessment may be more or less appropriate depending on what you want to do. So formative assessment, as I said, identifying learning needs, but if you're wanting to report to parents or you're wanting to use it to sort of summarise, you may want to use a summative assessment. But it's not quite that black and white, is it? Because sometimes you can have summative assessments that produce standardised scores, and yet they may also allow you to analyse individual questions for individual pupils and therefore also use it in a formative way to find out about learning needs. The key to good assessment practice, I believe, is to understand what each type of assessment is contributing to your assessment practice, and to build your assessment practice so it's as effective as it can be. And I think there's going to be some examples of that sort of coming up. So if I now turn to e-assessments, what you need to think about is, why am I using an e-assessment rather than another mode of assessment? What does it contribute? What does it give me that I can't get elsewhere? And be really aware of the advantages and disadvantages. I'm only going to mention a few of them. But for example, if you're thinking about e-assessment as opposed to other forms of assessment, such as paper tests, you've got things like interactive elements, drag and drop. You've got audio-visual elements that you can introduce. You can have automated marking, you can have portfolios, and you can also have, obviously, adaptive algorithms, which mean that you can personalise learning and assessment, and you can have pupils taking different routes through an assessment, which gives you a much more precise idea of where they are. They can also be disadvantaged, though, of course, and looking backwards, we can see that a lot of our online assessments were largely multiple choice. They restricted the sort of question types that you could use, and they restricted the response types, but a lot of that is changing, and we need to be aware of how that's changing. So think about how you want to use them and how you want to use the outcomes, and think about whether it's an advantage or a disadvantage. For example, automated marking can be great if all you want to generate is a standardised score. But if you want to look in detail at the pupils' responses, you might be better with something that you can look at those responses in more detail rather than just having a score. NFER are currently implementing an e-assessment research programme because we're very interested in the way things are moving at the moment and the direction of travel. Lots of countries are introducing national testing programmes now online, but not all of them are successful, and there are still a lot of issues to get through and work through. So we're looking at things like online assessments in different subjects, and particularly with different age groups, because there are lots of different issues depending on the age of the learner. Adaptive testing, technical innovations, and barriers to using assessments for high-stakes purposes. And we'll be reporting on our findings in the next 12 to 14 months. So I'm just going to finish with a couple of sort of things to think about. I'm sure you're going to hear about some ways in which technology can be used to enhance the experience of the learner. And by all means, use e-assessments if the outcomes are useful to you and they add to your knowledge of the student. But don't forget to evaluate them. I really want people, when they're picking assessments to use, to really evaluate them in the same way as you would do. Don't get excited because it's e-assessment. Think really critically about what the assessment is offering. Look at the technical information. How was it developed and by whom? If they're going to be used formatively, will they really support learning? Will they truly probe understanding of a particular part of the curriculum that you want to assess? And will they give the pupil to demonstrate their skills? And finally, if you're going to use them summatively, will they provide valid and reliable results? So, leaving you with those thoughts.
Thanks. That's great, Katherine. Actually, I'm going to ask Matthew to pick up on that. Don't get excited about technology. Matthew, I want you to get excited about technology now. How can technology be used to enhance the student and teacher experience?
Well, I think that technology has moved on hugely in the last few years. And if I think back about the time that I've been involved in the education market, the technology was risky 5-6 years ago. There were risks involved in using technology, or at least that was the perception. I actually disagree, and I think that they were less risky than people thought. But the technology has moved on hugely, and very, very stable now, very usable, very intuitive technology to be able to support that assessment process. It's a mature sector now, and it's starting to innovate in some of the ways that we were just touching on, with using adaptive algorithms and artificial intelligence to support the teacher's role in delivering those assessments. So, you know, it is a mature market. And just to give you an idea, so, and I should preface this, I suppose, by saying, so speaking as the association is designed to bring like-minded people together in terms of sharing best practice. And we have a membership that spans a whole range of different types of people, from individual teachers through to awarding bodies who are delivering assessments through the use of digital technologies. And when I knew I was doing this, I wrote to a few of our members and said, well, can you give me some examples of the scale of which you're using e-assessment now? Because I think it's one of these sectors that hides its light under a bushel to some degree. It's actually quite prolific in its use. So a couple of examples. One of our provider members has delivered 3.2 million student assessments in the last 12 months. And over the last 5 years, 17.5 million student assessments. We've got another member organisation who delivers roughly 1 million student assessments a year. And I spoke to one of the awarding bodies, City and Guilds, and asked them how much they deliver e-wise. And for them, over the last 5 years, that's 1.8 million students assessed through digital technology. So it's a prolific space now. And I think that's important because people need confidence that they can use e. I think you're absolutely right that it's a tool and you use it where it's appropriate to use it. But the benefits can be quite significant. I think there are some overall questions as to why you use E and when you do. Scalability is definitely one of those things. So if you're trying to reach large audiences or you're trying to bridge gaps, bridge between different cohort groups, that kind of thing, it's much easier to do that digitally. I think there is an argument, although it's balanced on both sides around whether it can be cheaper to deliver. I've got some interesting examples, again, from people who are part of the association, an awarding body saying that they think they save about 30% year on year on their operational costs by stopping shipping bits of paper around the place. Some universities in India who reckon they also save about 30% in not having to have the same thing marked by multiple people because the technology is facilitating a much smoother transition. And there's another example, a more exotic one from the Caribbean Exam Council, who reckon that they've saved about $1 million over 3 years in employing E. But it's not all about cost saving, that's for sure. It's also about supporting different ways of assessing stuff. And the benefits, going back to your question, to students and to teachers is really about the nuggets of good stuff that you get insights to in the use of digital. From a teaching perspective, it gives you much quicker, more accurate information. So you can then use that to inform your teaching moving forward. That's important. We all know that as teachers, that we have to listen and monitor what our students are doing. It's often quite difficult to do that in practice if you're doing it all mechanically, manually. Digital gives you that information at your fingertips. For the students, for the pupils, I think the biggest benefit potential is giving them greater clarity on what you want them to do. How do you want them to improve? What do you mean by I want you to do better? Because often that's quite difficult for them to understand. And digital technologies offer us new ways of doing that. A really interesting example at a university level was some work that the University of Edinburgh have been doing with an approach called comparative judgment, where students are using this approach to peer review their colleagues' work. And the insight into what good looks like for the learners has had a marked and dramatic positive impact on the students' attainment. The university think that it's about 14% positive impact on attainment, which is significant, helping people to understand much more clearly what you want them to do better so that they can do that stuff better. And there's lots of examples of how digital approaches can help facilitate that. And again, maybe because I'm a teacher, one particular thing I'm passionate about is making sure that the assessment is not done to the student, but they're part of that process. So they're part of the overall learning journey that is taking them from the point of knowing less to knowing more and giving them transparent insight into that process. I think that's a key piece. This morning, I was at Kingston University, where we're doing some work in my day job capacity, working with a financial services employer who are training people up to come on to work onto the trading floor. And they're working with Kingston University to facilitate that purpose. They're using an e-portfolio to provide transparent insight into how the students are progressing towards the end point, towards I'm going to now be employed as a trader on a floor, because the employer wants to have clear sight of that journey so that they can bring them on board as a proper employee as quickly as possible. So E, again, giving universal access for the teacher, for the learner, for the employer into understanding the journey that they're on. So there's lots of ways that it can impact, and I think it's really good to see a mature space innovating, using technology now. But I think there is a question, which I'm sure we'll come back to later, which is why don't we see more of it? Why don't we hear more of it? And so my challenge to all of you is if you do see good practice, shout about it, share it, talk about it amongst your colleagues, because I think that's the only way that will propagate really good use of the technology.
I'm going to pick up on Matt's comments there around teachers, students, and ask Richard to give us an overview of e-assessments at an operational level. And I know that you've made in your school significant impacts in turning the school around using e-assessment for the wider stakeholder group.
Okay. Yeah, I think from my point of view as a serving head teacher with, as I say, that overriding imperative to take schools that are underperforming or coasting or failing and turning them around in a rapid way, but in a sustainable, deep way, because quick fixes, that's the worst thing that happens to schools. You've got to put depth and detail into it. So when we were looking for systems that allowed us to do that, I'd spent 15 years turning schools around using a system that was paper-based that allowed us to get a standardized score validly once a year, and then we had to use a different system, again paper-based, that allowed us to get in-year progression, because just having snapshots once or twice a year is just not enough. And we did a due diligence process, whether you agree or not, depending on where you're based. From a UK point of view, I thought they were positive moves. The curriculum was changed back in 2014 to make it far tougher. So if you were a 10-year-old, you were now expected to learn and be at a standard of an 11-year-old. And a year later, national assessment methodologies were removed as well. So we had a sense, because that's my job as a head teacher, to see where the wave is heading and try and keep ahead of it and stay on the board. We saw that was happening, so we did a very detailed due diligence process looking at outstanding schools, and we came across a system that had been used in the UK from an e-assessment point of view for many, many years, and most people know it as Accelerated Reader. But sat behind Accelerated Reader, that's provided by Renaissance Learning, are STAR assessments. And while you're listening to this, if you Google the school, Plumcroft Primary School, on the front slide you'll see how we assess progress and attainment, so that will give you more detail about how we do it. And what I'm looking for from any assessment system is accuracy, fidelity. I need formative and I need summative. The way the UK system works now, our external inspection regime, they will come in without any notice at all. We get a phone call, I could have had it today and they'd be in tomorrow. We therefore have to have at our fingertips detailed information that's accurate and valid. Now, we could create a whole complex system that just does that bit, but actually that's a waste of time. What you need is one single unified system, and I'm just talking English and maths here. That's our focus, because if we can develop highly able children in terms of the core business of running a school, which is making them literate and numerate, it then gives us the space as an education environment to do all the really fascinating, joyful stuff of enriching their lives, their curriculum, their knowledge and their learning. But if we don't do the business of really accelerating core progress in reading, writing and maths, but my focus here is reading and maths, then everybody's at you. Therefore, you don't have the freedom educationally to do the really good stuff. Therefore, I needed a single system that would allow us to both take care of the external audiences, because that should be the easy bit, but more importantly, to give us very good quality, formative information to be able to inform teacher planning, pupil learning, and make it a very seamless approach. And with Renaissance Learning and their STAR assessments, we get standardized scores, we get percentile ranks, we get scaled score between 0 and 1400, so we get a real granular level of detail. And all of what sits behind it is phenomenal science. It's well worth spending 5 minutes of your own time looking at Renaissance Learning and the science behind STAR assessments. NFER deconstructed the new national curriculum. And from my point of view as an educator, fidelity and integrity in science matters in assessment, because there's a lot of people that really are making it up as they go along, frankly. And NFER were employed with a whole bunch of their specialists to deconstruct the new national curriculum and then assign all of the STAR assessments that the children do, every single question mapped into that deconstructed national curriculum. So it completely maps into the new national curriculum. Because they have that level of granular detail, the children on an iPad, there's something like 34 questions for reading, 25 questions for maths, those kind of numbers. So it doesn't take long. So it's low stakes in the sense of teacher time. The outcomes are immediately available, both at a teacher level plus a management level. But because of the fidelity and accuracy of all of those questions being mapped into the curriculum, what we end up with is fascinating learning progressions that are completely mapped. And so from those detailed scale scores we get, we're able to really understand at a teacher level what they need to learn next, their proximal areas of learning. So if you're familiar with accelerated reader, you get a ZPD, a zone of proximal learning. And every child in my school, you can ask any one of the children what their ZPD is, what's their zone of proximal development, and they will know. It'll be two numbers, it'll be 2.3 to 4.2, and all of our books throughout our school are mapped into these zones of proximal development, because that will take the children forward in an accelerated way. It's not comfort reading, they don't just read at the level they're comfortable at. The books have been carefully mapped so that you understand where they need to go next, and the children are fully involved, e-assessment with children involvement. But my key passion, amongst many things, but particularly in terms of e-assessment, is with the STAR assessments, I'm able every 6 weeks, we do this every 6 weeks, to get an age standardized score that's comparable with a sample size. There's over 1.3 million children in the UK use STAR assessments, something like 4,000 or 5,000 schools. You have this massive national database, and with a standardized score, you know that 100, if they're at 100 or above, they're doing well. That's their age-related expectation. So we can use that detail to do the summative, and then we can use all of the really good stuff, which is the learning progressions mapped in, to be able to map the learning journey with the children. And so deliberate practice, teachers use that in a highly focused rather than generic way, and surprise, surprise, standards, it looks like magic. It's just pure hard work and talented teachers, but having systems that allow us to have deliberate practice, and it goes, and the outside world think, oh, how did you do that? And then that frees us to do the really great stuff and take them to the London Symphony Orchestra or get them to go to the beach and build a sandcastle. It allows us that freedom educationally by having precision.
Okay, that's great. So thank you for those that have sent in questions. I think I've only got 1 minute left, actually, panel. So I'm actually going to put one of those questions. So thank you, Farrell. And you've got no more than a sentence to respond to this. So Farrell's asking the panel, how can one infuse metacognitive learning, so learning to learn, into assessments? Is it more suitable to formative or summative assessment? So how can we infuse learning to learn into assessments? Okay, so you've got no more than a couple of sentences. Wow, that's a challenge in itself. And then we can wrap up.
Do you want me to take that one? Yeah? I think that whole sense of learning to learn, by having precision of learning progressions, by knowing what, and this is shared fully with the children, have complete transparency of this, by sharing in a precise way what they need to learn next, not just what's on the curriculum map in terms of this is what in year 5 you're supposed to teach, this precision that flows from your assessments, this is what we need to learn next. And that whole learning to learn, it's precision as opposed to generic, let's just do what everybody else is doing. And that's where e-assessment, it genuinely, personalised is a hijacked word these days, but it's genuinely at a pupil level.
Yeah, okay, so that's it. I want to say thank you to you as delegates. We can continue outside in the foyer if you want to ask us any more questions individually. Thank you.
Good.